transgenic foods. You think you eat healthily? You're against genetically manipulated foods? Just like you, more than 70% of European citizens say no to transgenic foods. Still, you too have long since eaten transgenic foods without even knowing. For example, 70% of worldwide soy production is already genetically modified. Such plants are being produced by the introduction of foreign genes. In this way, two main new characteristics emerge. Either the plants are resistant to phytotoxins, or they produce toxins themselves which kill pests and other animals. These plants then spread uncontrollably as wind and insects disseminate the pollen. 90% of all genetically modified plants are cultivated in America and exported to Europe on a grand scale. All in all, 80% of all transgenic plants are being processed for pet food and are largely fed to production animals. In this way, genetically modified organisms end up in your food too. Legally though, this does not need to be labelled on meat, eggs and milk products. Perhaps you're wondering whether this is dangerous at all. Well, there are already animal studies which document verifiable health consequences. And what's bad for animals can become dangerous for humans too. It's just that no long-term studies have been conducted on this up till now. But wait, we are all part of the long-term study already. And we are all the guinea pigs of the big agricultural companies. So this concerns us all.
We will ensure that biotech products will receive the same oversight as other products, instead of being hampered by unnecessary regulation.
Patents historically have been for things like, I've used the example of a carburetor. Well, a carburetor doesn't get up one day and start replicating itself everywhere and introducing itself into your car, so that all of a sudden then you get sued for patent infringement.
I think this is probably the largest biological experiment humanity has ever entered into.
Over the past 100 years, our food supply has greatly improved through traditional plant breeding. Now we're beginning to reap the first fruits of the genetically modified harvest. Genetic engineering is moving fast, and many people find it hard to decide whether genetically modified plants are a good thing or a bad thing. Novel food regulations require GM food and all other foods new to the market to go through extensive safety testing procedures to make sure they do not contain substances that might cause toxic or allergic reactions. In some tests, thousands of samples are analysed and compared based on their molecular and genetic composition. Other tests make use of atomic rather than molecular comparisons between GM and non-GM food. This way it's possible to see to what extent foods vary in their composition. Insect-resistant and weed spray-tolerant crops, for example, have been approved this way to make food for us to eat. Environmentalists have three main concerns: that GM crops will create superbugs and superweeds or reduce biodiversity, but above all, they're worried about the irreversibility of GM crop releases.
Our concern is basically just the release of genetically modified organisms into the environment. Right? We are not opposed to using genetic engineering in contained facilities, and that's a different story.
In the open environment, pollen from transgenic crops could pollinate another related plant. If they cross with their wild relatives, there could be the danger of creating superweeds resistant to herbicides. And if they cross with non-GM crops on organic farms, for example, the farmers couldn't guarantee the non-GM origin of their food product. The first commercial products of genetic engineering were plants resistant to pests and weed killers. It's mainly the farmers that reap the benefits. Now, researchers in Europe and many other parts of the world are developing new products designed to be of direct benefit to the consumer. Many of these research advances will be used in the developed world, where there are potentially large enough markets for the new products. For developing countries, priorities depend on local circumstances and are often a question of need rather than choice. Areas under active research include plants that are resistant to high salt content in the soil or to drought. Great efforts are going into creating foods designed to be positively good for you. For example, tests are underway on a GM rice designed to increase levels of vitamin A in the human body. One problem for decision makers is that there are no agreed international standards for assessing the risks of GM crops and GM food. Different countries base their judgments on different sets of questions, and not all countries have access to good testing facilities. In North America, decisions are based primarily on scientific judgments about safety. This approach means GM crop developments are moving ahead quite fast, but if something goes wrong, the guilty parties could be sued. Europe's precautionary principle tries to avoid unexpected consequences. It allows decision makers to proceed cautiously with GM crops. Their decisions are based on social considerations as well as the available scientific evidence. Without an international agreement on standards, food producers face real problems in developing and selling GM products to countries in other parts of the world. And even if international standards could be agreed on, there's no mechanism to enforce them. This is now the challenge for the decision makers.
The biggest difference between classical plant breeding and genetical engineering is that in genetical engineering you go much more specific for the characters you are interested in. In plant breeding, you always combine a huge number of genes and you have to do a lot of selection. In gene technology, you take the best plant already available and add the few characters you are interested in so that your breeding efficiency is very much increased.
Potatoes are a good example of our breeding efforts. Over the centuries, traditional plant breeders have turned the wild potatoes that are still found in Peru into the wide varieties of potatoes that we can buy today. Because of these efforts, potatoes can be grown all over the world. The varieties of potatoes we grow today are different from their wild cousins. They've been genetically modified through traditional plant breeding, so every variety of potato differs slightly in its DNA. This is the DNA extracted from a single potato. DNA contains genes that make that potato what it is. Genes are sets of instructions for making different proteins. And it's the proteins that determine the exact properties of the plant. Genetic engineering involves adding an extra piece of DNA to a living cell. Scientists will have studied this piece of DNA for many years before putting it into a cell.